Well, it certainly is reminiscent of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we frequently would pick up someone that we were convinced was a Soviet agent. Most of the time they were, but not always. Essentially use them as trading material so that someone that the Soviets had picked up could be freed in some exchange. I don't know if that's the case this time around, but perhaps it is. But the thing to keep in mind is that this Wall Street Journal is very anti-Russian and extremely neoconservative in its outlook. It certainly doesn't bear any resemblance to the Wall Street Journal I grew up with. And as a result, they're not very sympathetic to the Wall Street Journal and its owners. And of course, the owner is Rupert Murdoch. And I don't know that anyone has said anything about it other than I think Tucker mentioned it on his program that this man had been apprehended. Now, he was a long, long way from Moscow, and I have no idea what he was doing. He was within striking distance of some Russian military installation. And theoretically, he was trying to write a story on what the impact was on Russia of the war, and whether or not its industries were actually producing, and so forth. Whatever was the case, he was picked up, and I don't think the Russians are going to be very sympathetic.
Do the Russians respect journalistic rights? Does he have some immunity because he's a bona fide journalist for a bona fide American media outlet, albeit one that is anti-Russian?
Well, you can be a bona fide Russian journalist with all the right credentials. And if you are seen photographing or visiting Virginia, say in the vicinity of Norfolk, and we are in a state of war, I think we would pick the man up. The thing that has to be brought in mind is the Russians are at war. And under those circumstances, it's very foolish to go near any military installation. And that's why I say, if we were at war and we saw people nosing around submarine pens up in Puget Sound or a large Air Force base in Florida, we would pick them up right away.
So Jack Devine, and we'll run a clip from him a little later on, says that the Central Intelligence Agency does not use American journalists to do its dirty work, only foreign journalists. Is it inconceivable that Mr. Hershkowitz was working for American intelligence?
You know, I simply don't know. What I do know is that he would probably willingly turn over any information he found to the CIA because he's very hostile to Russia. Just as the CIA is doing everything in its power to keep this operation going in any way, shape, or form it can. It's trying to shape domestic opinion. We know that. It creates the narratives that are widespread inside the United States on everything right now connected to Russia. So does he work for them? In theory, no. Does that make any difference under the circumstances? Again, Russia is at war. This is an American journalist. He is somewhere close to or en route to a Russian military installation. He's going to get picked up. Got it?
What is the status of all of the tanks that everybody was all agog about a month or so ago? The German Leopards and the American Abrams. Have they arrived? Are they on their way there? What is the likelihood that they will tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of the Ukrainians?
Well, as far as I know, the numbers of American M1 series tanks have not arrived. I don't know when they're going to show up, but they're certainly in the process of being ready for use by the Ukrainians. The Leopards have shown up, as have some of the other pieces of equipment, and of course, the Bradleys. They're not really tanks. That's an armed fighting vehicle, but it does have a 25mm chain gun on it that's very lethal. I don't know if they also are going to equip them with tow missiles. That's also a lethal missile under the right circumstances. I think what people are discovering is that the Russians have a number of missiles. One of them is called the Kornet, and this Kornet missile can be fired from 5,000 meters away or potentially even further. It's self-guiding. Once you sight the target, you can essentially fire and forget it. And if that warhead reaches a tank, any tank, it would destroy the tank. It doesn't make any difference what it is. So that is something that I guess people are now beginning to notice, because the Cornet missiles were used against Leopard tanks in Syria. And people should be very concerned about that. Again, this is something I think other analysts have said. It's not an individual weapon system. It's not the arrival of 200 tanks or 500 tanks that are going to make any difference. It's the integration of various types of equipment: tanks, armed fighting vehicles, various missile carriers, air defense, air and missile defense. For instance, there's a 30mm automatic cannon linked to radar that's excellent, that's produced by Rheinmetall. I would say you probably need a couple hundred of them on the battlefield, just to protect yourself from all the various unmanned aerial systems. So the bottom line is, no, this isn't going to change anything.
Do the tanks have some weaponry or equipment in their skin, for lack of a better word, a lay phrase, to neutralize the weaponry that attacks them?
Well, they have what you would call active versus passive defense. An active defense system can be all sorts of things. It could be small explosives embedded in ceramic and metal tile that is applied on the outside of the tank's armor. There are different kinds of this thing. You actually can put radar on the tank itself that detects an incoming missile. All of this stuff exists. The problem is twofold. First of all, most of that active equipment only works once. In other words, once you've struck the tank once, you don't have that protection anymore. In other words, you get a direct hit. If you strike it twice, you may get something more, but then you're essentially naked. It only gets you through a couple of initial fights. We don't have anything right now to deal with what I would call top attack. In other words, a missile that comes in and strikes on top of the turret. This has been a threat for a long time. In other words, it comes in and it dives down on the top of the turret where the armor is thin. The Israelis are looking at a number of very innovative ways to change that. It can be integrated into future armed fighting vehicles.
Do the Russians have missiles that will
do that? Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. By the way, so do the Germans. And they have not released any of those. We've been working on those, and I think we have some, if they're not already fielded in the US military, and they may or may not be. I don't know. They certainly are in development. These are the new threats that are changing the nature of warfare. This is what effectively robs you of your mobility on the battlefield, and robs you of your ability to use all of this armor that historically we've relied on to come to terms with the enemy, to go right in and kill the enemy at close range. It's not going to be solved quickly. It's like World War II, when suddenly people discovered machine guns, artillery mines, barbed wire, and trenches, and the maneuver stopped. We're in a similar conundrum. It won't last forever, and we're going to have to find a way through it. But the bottom line is we're not really prepared for it.
The head of the Wagner Group has proclaimed that Bakhmut has fallen. President Zelensky has not refuted that. It seems to me, as a layperson in the military world 10,000 miles away, that it's safe to say that Bakhmut has fallen. Do you have any intel on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Prigozhin made a number of interesting remarks.
That's the head of the Wagner Group.
Of the Wagner Group, right? And Prigozhin said something that many of us have suspected was the case for months. But now we've had it from the horse's mouth, and I think it's probably true. And that is a Sorving, the general that was brought in the early fall, late summer last year to change the command structure and the way the Russians were operating, decided to turn Bakhmoth into what it became, a bloodbath, a meat grinder. So they were deliberately leaving Bakhmoth partially surrounded, and in the hopes that more and more and more Ukrainian forces would be poured into it, they could be systematically destroyed. That's the way it looked to me for a long time.
And is that the way it worked out?
Yes, absolutely. It's been brilliant for the Russians. This is the best thing that could happen to them. And one of the things that people don't understand is, well, why didn't they just cut this off and be done with it? Why aren't they doing that? Well, there's a reason, because if your enemy comes to you, and I just described the battlefield that we're on now, which is not very favorable or friendly to large maneuver forces. So you have to infiltrate into this World War I setting, if that's what you're operating on.